Welcome to A Voice from the Hills. I'm James Warner, co-founder of Silicon Hills Wealth Management here in Austin, Texas. And our guest on today's podcast is Penny Phillips. Penny spent her career searching for success. Specifically, those traits that certain entrepreneurs and leaders have that allow them to build winning cultures and firms that succeed in all types of environments. She's founded and run a thriving consulting business. She's an executive coach. She's a frequent keynote speaker. And over the last 2 years, she's taken those lessons learned and all her coaching experience and doubled down on that to build a multi-billion-dollar firm of her own. So today we are pleased to welcome Penny to the podcast to talk about success as only Penny can. So please join me in welcoming Penny Phillips.
James Warner is the founding partner of Silicon Hills Wealth Management and the host of A Voice from the Hills podcast. All opinions expressed by James, his co-host, and his guest are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Silicon Hills Wealth Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of Silicon Hills Wealth Management may maintain positions in securities discussed in this podcast.
Good morning, Penny, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
I kind of wanted to start with just change in general, especially how it affects smaller businesses in our industry and industries outside wealth management. Could you comment on what you're seeing in your world and how it might translate to the world at large?
Sure. There are some very specific changes impacting the wealth management and financial advisory space, but there are some themes that are relevant across every industry. And I sort of look at it right now as these three themes. Number one, scale and customization. Everyone, regardless of industry, is trying to figure out how to deliver services to the end consumer at scale that makes each person, each customer or client feels like that service was created or delivered specifically for them. And we've seen that with, the Netflixes and Amazons of the world. We've been able to use technology to deliver a service to somebody that feels like it's customized specifically for them. That's going to be an increasingly important theme in the coming years across every industry. The second thing I'm seeing is the changing profile, not just of the end consumer or client, but the changing profile of the employee in the organization. And this is something we're facing a lot in our industry. How do we deliver services to a generation of client that looks, thinks, acts radically different from the baby boomer consumer of the past? And this is, and it's the next gen consumer, but it's not just millennials, it's Gen Zers, it's young Gen Xers who've, number one, grown up in a highly tech-enabled world, and a world where social media and community really shape the way in which they make buying decisions. Now, that second piece of that, when I talk about the changing profile of the employee, this is something that's relevant across every industry. How do we build a business where there's synergy among employees of different generations who, again, think about work and think about work-life balance radically different? So this clash of the generations, that's a theme that's present not just with the employees in the business, but also with the consumers. And then the final thing I'll say is I think we're seeing this especially post-pandemic. This idea that technology and artificial intelligence is impacting and changing the world, that's not a new concept. But I think for the first time ever, businesses are recognizing that the belief systems, especially small business owners, the belief systems they held about the business, right? Like we need to be present in an office, or we need to, be face to face with people, making deals or whatever it is. The world has changed beyond that. And we're proving that we can do business and run businesses in a different way than we ever expected. And I think the people who are going to embrace that concept moving forward, and I say this a lot, James, and shed belief systems that are no longer serving them well as business owners are the ones that are going to thrive moving forward. So also, just to sum it up, it's the changing consumer and employee profile, it's scale and customization, and then finally it's this idea of doing things differently and using tech to enable that.
And some of that you talked about, I guess that really refers to culture. Um, you're first generation American, born in New York City,
Correct?
but obviously your Greek heritage is still very strong, and you kind of honor that culture and that guides you. Do you find that some of these smaller businesses or just businesses in general have their own cultures? And as you're integrating them, you have to respect that culture or maybe even talk with them about how they need to modify it?
It's a really great question. So I'll say this: culture starts at the top. We know that, especially in the small business space. The founder, the leader, the statesman of the business has a tremendous impact on the culture of the organization. And so I'll answer it in two ways. The first way I'll say is yes, I think it's going to become increasingly more important that we, and this is an important concept, especially for the younger generation, which is why I was alluding to the different generations. It, it's becoming increasingly more important for us to honor each employee's individuality than ever before. And what I mean by that is, if you, especially in financial services, if you worked in, big corporations, or you ever worked in any of the big banks, what you felt or where you came from, it didn't really matter. Decades ago, it was sort of a sea of sameness in the organization, and it was driven very much by the top. That entire model has flipped on its head. It's We as business owners in our space or outside need to be focused on the what the client needs, what the client values, what the client's culture is, and also what our employees value and what impact they want to have. Otherwise, they're not going to stay in our organization. So I would say yes, it's about culture and background, but it's also about this idea that the younger generation of employee grew up in a world where they don't just stay at an organization for 30 years, to get a pin at the end of the 30 years and then, retire. They stay at organizations that make them feel valued, that make them feel a connection to a greater purpose. So this idea that we need to really tap into what's driving and motivating each person and tie that to our greater vision, that's going to be critical for firms that want to sustain and thrive over the next coming decades, because it's just a totally different landscape now with the younger employee.
And so, speaking of the word thrive, I mean, through your work with Thrivos, you've worked with a lot of successful people, a lot of leaders, um, and you became kind of obsessed with, why are certain leaders and certain entrepreneurs just more successful than others in all different environments. Throughout your consulting career, what are a couple things that you take away from those people who operate those firms that just seem to win regardless of the environment?
That's such a great question. And I will say, what I've noticed consulting and coaching hundreds and hundreds of financial advisors, but in some cases, getting to know their clients as well, in many cases, are business owners. It's three things that have nothing to do with industry, and really not a whole lot to do with technical competency in a field. Meaning, the best financial advisors, the most technically competent financial professionals, are not necessarily the best leaders. So it's three things. It's number one. I said it a couple minutes ago. The best in the business have the ability to come in every day to the business without a preconceived notion about what's going to work today versus what worked yesterday. In other words, they are very comfortable operating in the unknown. They're very comfortable with this idea that what got us here won't get us there. what worked even a quarter ago as it relates to how, let's say, we're marketing may not necessarily work moving forward. And they're very comfortable consistently and constantly shedding belief systems and behaviors that no longer serve them well. So they are what I call, as a coach, highly coachable individuals. That's number one. The second thing is they are obsessed with this concept of making themselves less relevant over time to the business. Not irrelevant, but less relevant, meaning it doesn't mean they don't have an ego. It simply means that they recognize that they can't control everything. And I would say this is the biggest hindrance to sort of that explosive growth. It's the leader of the organization who's built it from scratch, has an obsession with the details. They want to be part of every single decision, and they're hanging on to this idea that if I don't do it, it's not going to get done as well. Well, the best in the business, again, able to live in that discomfort, they're able to step away from that and recognize that I need to let other people fail. I need to let other people succeed in a way that's right for them. I need to let other people make decisions, even if it's not the decision I would make, because they know that that's the ultimate way to get success, is to create a business that can exist without you constantly being there. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing I would say is this concept I call relentless prospecting, and it's relevant to advisors and beyond. The best believe so deeply in what they're building and what they're doing that they have to talk about it all the time. They are a walking advertisement for their business and for their brand. And it's not because of ego or because they have, quotas they want to fill. It's simply because they believe so deeply in either the nobility of what they're doing or the impact of what they're doing. And that's an X factor that's very, very hard to teach. But the ones that embody it, those are the people that tend to be successful.
And so the combination of that person who can have that relentless prospecting, I mean, they just wake up in the morning and they can't wait to tell people about, they're almost evangelists for what they're doing.
Correct.
Right. If you pair that with the ability to pivot, then you've got two really key, if we're talking to entrepreneurs out there, if you could focus on those two skills, build a business that you feel so good about that you can't wait to talk about it every day, but build one that you're willing to pivot off of, and you're also willing to turn over control to more and more people over time. I mean, that's almost the recipe for success.
Yes. And people will listen and say, well, yeah, that sounds so, of course that's what, it's so difficult to do though. I know, people tend to say that. And so there are ways in which you can coach yourself towards those two outcomes. And so what I recommend for folks that are struggling with this or want to lean in more to these two areas, the first thing I would say is train yourself to be a relentless prospector, meaning every single conversation you have in a day with any key stakeholder, whether it's a family member, a client, a prospect, a center of influence, find a way to talk about, not about yourself or the business, but about the value you provide. In one way or another, in every single conversation, and practice it for a week, every single conversation you have with somebody on the phone or in person, find a way to weave in a story about how you've helped somebody, what you've learned over the last 2 years, being in the pandemic and post-pandemic, a win that you've shared with a client or customer. Find a way to start building that confidence about consistently talking about what you do, because the work and whatever you do is so impactful that you need to share it. So that's one thing. The piece about control, I used to coach advisors on spending an isolated amount of time, whether it was a day or a week, practicing giving up control. In other words, an email, and this is a very simple example, but it's one that we face a lot as leaders in this business. Like, an email needs to get sent, and you're dying to be the one to send it, or you're dying to be the one to craft it. practice intentionally allowing someone else to do it and not reacting, and start very small, because it can be really overwhelming for people who are type A control freaks and want to handle every aspect of a meeting or whatever it is.
It's almost like you were at our Slack channel yesterday, Penny. I got to tell you.
Listen, we're a team of 23 now. I mean, I've coming from a team of 4 over the course of 18 months. Imagine how I feel trying slowly but surely to sort of give up control. But choosing a color palette for a website. One of the top things that I see advisors, and I'm sure it's across industries, get hooked in on is these small little decisions. Practice intentionally pulling yourself out from a series of decisions over the course of a week and see how it feels. What you ultimately find out is that nothing detrimental happens to the business. Literally, nothing detrimental will happen to the business or clients, even if somebody makes a mistake, by the way. But you have to intentionally practice, just like with relentless prospecting. You have to intentionally practice.
And so let's talk about the other side of that, listening. In some of your recent presentations, the one at Riskalyze in particular, you talked about the importance of listening, the importance of when you go into a conversation, having something in mind that you want to get out of that conversation, and being really intentional about how you're listening, and also be aware of ways in which you are listening but not listening. Can you give the audience kind of, can't give us the whole presentation, but can you give us the high points on that?
I love that presentation. Yes. And, let me give context around this. And you're really talking about emotional intelligence skills and the ability to actively listening, not for the sake of listening, but for the sake of deriving something important from the conversation that's going to help you serve that customer or client better. This is the most important thing you can ever talk about in business in today's world. Why? Because of what I was describing earlier about the entire essentially marketing funnel being turned on its head. Meaning, in our industry, decades ago, the model was very firm centric, right? So when the commercial was when E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen. Meaning, what we say as the industry or as the corporation or as the business dictates the way in which the consumer should think about their problem and should think about the solution to that problem. Firm centric. In the age of social media and Yelp and Facebook groups and Reddit and Twitter, that model has flipped entirely on its head. Meaning the client, the consumer, the customer dictates their challenge. And they dictate not just the solution, but how they want to receive the solution. And by the way, if you don't deliver it to them that way, then they're writing a review about you. They're complaining about you to their friends. And that complaint is amplified times 100 because they're on social media. And so it is now a completely consumer-centric model in every single industry. So the responsibility is on us as the professionals, business owners, to get better at simply understanding the psychographics of the client or consumer. The only way we can do that, the only way, is not just paying attention to data points and social media profiles of the people we're serving, but it's about listening intently to conversations. And so the presentation you're referring to, I talk about the importance of driving mindfulness, active listening, and empathy. And I'll give you just a couple of ideas that are helpful anywhere, even, by the way, when you're in conversations with a spouse or family member. Number one, always know what you're listening for. Well, before that, know your listening hindrances. A lot of us who are in business, who are ultimately trying to sell something to somebody, because at the end of the day, yes, this is a relationship business. It's always a relationship business, but we have an end goal. One of the most important things you can do is understand your listening hindrances. When we are trying to get to an outcome, we either become very defensive listeners, so we're always listening for the objection, right? We go into a conversation prepared to combat any pushback we get from the client about price, about service, whatever it is. The other thing we tend to do is we tend to be selfish listeners. we think that if we hear something from a client or customer that we relate to, we immediately want to share our similar story or situation. And the extreme example of this is the one-upper. We all know a one-upper. Like, you were in you were in traffic for an hour. Well, they were just in traffic for 4 days on a freeway somewhere and had to walk to their house. Like, that is how they relate. Neither of those listening styles are conducive to really understanding the consumer at the other end of the conversation. So my recommendation for folks is practice going into conversations as objectively as possible, with no bias, no preconceived notion about what you're trying to achieve or what the other person wants to achieve, and start every conversation with a simple question. We've got 30 minutes together today, or so happy that you're meeting with us, or glad to be here. What is it that you'd really like to achieve at the end of this conversation? What role might I be able to play in helping you solve the problem? In what ways can we be helpful to you as and so on and so forth? So always using those what or how questions while being objective to allow the other person to not just open up, but give us the information we need. Everything that we could possibly need to know about the client and how to serve them, we should get that information right from them. The last thing I'll say about being a selfish listener, remember that the way to connect deeply with people is not sharing a story that matches theirs. It's about being empathetic and curious. It's about getting them to talk more about that experience they had. And so I tell people, practice, instead of relating with similarities, practice being simply curious. What was that experience like? Gosh, how did the rest of your day go? You're in traffic for an hour. Did it set off the rest of your day? How do you get into a positive mindset when you have like a frustrating experience in the morning? Be curious about their experience. And so that kind of sums up the presentation.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your background. People wouldn't know this if they went to one of your presentations or listened to you speak, but you did have some challenges with anxiety growing up.
Yes, I did.
And as I was reading some of the things that you posted years ago, I came across one thing that was I just loved it. And it was, you talked about anxiety almost as a companion, and anxiety as a companion that actually helps you be empathetic. And you talked about the positive side of anxiety. I'm sure a lot of our listeners, suffer from anxiety. We all suffer from, the idea of, am I good enough? Is this presentation good enough? I've got that new promotion. Am I really, do I really deserve it? I think one thing that we can all, regardless of our backgrounds, we can all kind of relate to is, if it's not a constant dealing with anxiety, there's certainly moments that we all have that. Talk to me about how you made that realization. And I wouldn't say that you've come to peace with anxiety necessarily reading what I've read, but it looks like you've harnessed it. Talk to the audience a little bit about that and how you came to that realization.
And James, wow, you're bringing up a piece I wrote for the Huffington Post actually years ago about anxiety, and I think the title of it was "My Best Friend Anxiety" or something. And I've never talked about that. No one's ever asked me about that piece, so this is a very interesting question to me. So what I'll say is, and talk to anyone who's leading or has had success in business, and especially women. Imposter syndrome, anxiety, all these things tend to be present and hand in hand with the success that we've had. So what I'll say is this is, two books that really changed my perspective on how to harness what can be viewed as weaknesses. One was The Four Agreements, which is a fantastic book, and one is the book Untamed, which was a bestseller and is sort of all about accepting yourself, etc. What I'd say is, people with anxiety, and yes, I've struggled very much my whole life. It's manifested in very different ways. over the course of my career and as a youngster, it was very hyper focused on details, very obsessed with perfection. And with that comes, you drive yourself crazy, but you also have this unbelievable drive to succeed and to do things the right way. And having challenges with yourself helps you be empathetic to the challenges of others. And what I found as a woman in financial services, which is rare, is that I tend to pick up on things that I notice other people don't pick up on in meetings, especially in negotiations or M&A discussions. A change of tone of voice, inflection in the inflection points in how someone's talking, body language, something that they say that I know ties to a belief system they have about themselves that might hinder the decision-making process for them. So my point is in being so hyper analytical and critical of yourself, it actually gives you great insight into the way people think and operate, which not just makes you empathetic, but helps you guide them in conversations and discussions. You're never free of these challenges, I think, but I think as you get older and as you surround yourself with people who are accepting of the different ways in which you show up, it becomes easier to be delicate and compassionate with yourself, which I think is the sort of meaning of all of this. It's the answer to all of it. We're all complex beings. I think a challenge for me has always been coming from a very cultural background. Mental health was not talked about. Women had a very specific role in the family and in society. And so breaking free from that, you're constantly fighting with yourself. You're constantly fighting against what people want you to be, what they think you should be, which only further fuels the anxiety. When you get to a place of understanding and being compassionate and gentle with yourself, it makes it easier to deal with, and also funnel it into, drive towards building a business, like excitement. And I do present on stage. People, knowing my background, find it very interesting and ironic that I present on stage to hundreds of people, knowing how much I've suffered. And what I'll say is, it does make you really shine in the moments that you're supposed to, because there's so much sort of pressure and analysis that has gone into preparation that you just nail it. So long-winded answer, but I think a lot of people could relate.
And so now you've transitioned from the consulting world to actually building a firm. I forget how many billions of dollars you guys have under management now, but talk to me about when you decided to make the journey toward Journey.
Yes.
And how is it different coaching successful entrepreneurs and leaders and talking with those same people about possibly joining your firm?
Yeah, it's such a funny question. I will say it's radically different, coaching versus actually building the business. And I've spent pretty much my whole career consulting within the financial services space, or coaching. And consulting, fancy way to say, helping people solve problems, critical challenges in the organization. And coaching, I define coaching as the way like a life coach might define it, but specifically in this space. So helping people really become their best selves, draw out the answers from them. So two totally different disciplines that I've worked within for over a decade. And what I was seeing, James, was that I was coaching advisors and then consulting them on how to build businesses within the institution they were at, and then leave and do their own thing. And I felt that many of the folks who'd gone through that process with me weren't happy at the end of it. Meaning they were happy that they were building a bigger business or were leaving a big institution to go out on their own and do their own thing. But what I found was that many of them wanted to get back to the discipline that the business was built on, meaning they wanted to get back to being an advisor. And I have heard this over and over from advisors who work with business owner clients, whether it's a medical professional who runs a medical practice, or whether it's a tradesman who now, runs a larger organization. Sometimes there's this unhappiness or unfulfillment with running them. I mean, operating a business is not easy. It's the most challenging thing. And so what I was finding was that advisors didn't really like operating the business or building it. They wanted to be in charge. They wanted to have ownership, but they didn't want to actually operate it. And so their options were either to go out and hire somebody to operate it, hire like a CEO or COO, which is a big spend, or join an organization that does that behind the scenes and allows them to be advisors, to do what they love doing, which is talking to people and selling and advising and delivering wealth management services. And so I said during the pandemic, I said, well, what if I just build this paradise business that I've been coaching advisors on how to build? And I set out to do that with my 4 partners. We're just under 3 billion in AUM. A lot of that has to do with my partners who brought books of business to help start up this entity. We've attracted 4 other advisory teams, 4 other businesses to us, 2 of which we've acquired, and we're building it. And I would say the biggest, it's funny because coaching advisors and consulting them, it's sort of easy as an objective party to see the gaps, to give the blueprint for how to solve problems. When you're in it, it's very different. You're so tied to the outcome. And again, maybe this is the anxiety talking too. You're so tied to how people are perceiving you and what your team is thinking, and are they happy, and are the clients happy, and or is there a better way we could be doing? You're so tied to all of it because it's yours. It's very difficult to step away and make the objective decisions that the consultant or coach wants you to make. So I am finding myself having to self-coach every single day, all day, in order to be the business owner that I know I need to be.
Well, I forget who said it, but they talked about the fact that, freedom isn't free, and independence depends. And I think a lot of people make moves for freedom and independence, and they don't realize they know what they're leaving. And I think this is true for a lot of our retirees too. They know what they're retiring from, but they're not necessarily altogether sure what they're retiring to. And I think you gave some really good advice, and we tend to give this same advice to any of our clients who've gone through a difficult transition, whether it's death, divorce, sale of a business, whatever it happens to be. You need to give yourself some time. If you think you're going to make this move, give yourself 6 months to really think through it, and not necessarily. I think in a very short order, you know exactly what you're leaving. But I think the question that we all have to ask before we take that next step is, what are we going to, and what are we hoping to get out of it? So when you're talking to these firms that obviously they're considering leaving their current situation in some way, shape, or form, you're now the path that they would go to, as opposed to the coach that might be motivating them to make the change. How much of this is you trying to determine whether this is the right firm to bring into your culture, and how much of it is the other firm trying to determine whether you're the right destination for them to go to?
That's a good question. You just said something that I want to comment on. This idea that we don't always know what we're going to, and you were talking about retirees. One of the most important questions you could ever ask yourself, and I say this to advisors who are leaving the big, wirehouses to go independent, but it's really anybody who's breaking out on their own or building a business. It's, how do I define freedom? What I found with financial advisors and professionals is they equate freedom to not having somebody telling them what to do, right? Whether it's a boss or whether it's a corporation or whatever. But what ends up happening when you're on your own building a business is that you don't have anybody telling you what to do, but you have to be the one to make about 1,000 different decisions that you probably don't want to be making. And so it's really important to clarify, like, what does freedom mean? And I found that with advisors, for a lot of them, freedom meant working with the client, getting back to the things that motivated me about it. It had nothing to do with running a business. So, I mean, it's the question is important for anybody going through any sort of transition. How do I define freedom? How do I define fulfillment? What are the things that I am doing on an ongoing basis that make me feel fulfilled? So that was a really, really important point. Now I'll get back to your question, which I, of course, forgot. If you could repeat it, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So when you're in negotiations with these firms, how much of it is them buying into you or you buying into them?
Yeah. So, it should probably be more of us figuring out if they're the best fit. But most of the time, and this is our process is a little bit different intentionally because we want to differentiate. I've been through the M&A process with advisors as their coach and consultant, and I've seen how aggressive it is, how focused it is on the buyer and not the seller or the person making the transition, let's say. And so I want to flip that on its head. So our conversations are really, I would say, about neither. At the beginning, it really is about helping the advisor clarify what is it that they really want. If they come to us and say, I want to be independent, I'm making this up, I want freedom, I want, the ability to build the business how I want. Okay, like, what does that really mean? Like, take us, a day or a week in your perfect life. Talk to us about the key stakeholders, your family members. How do they feel about this decision? So our conversations start out, relating to what I said a couple minutes ago, as objective as we could possibly be, knowing that our purpose in this industry is much bigger than getting advisors to join Journey. It's about getting every advisor, and in some ways, the advisor is our client, right? The clients are our client too, but the advisor are our client. Getting the advisor to find their forever home, number one, whether that's us or somebody else. And secondly, educating the advisor on the options that exist. This is one of the problems with when we're firm centric or business centric and not consumer centric, is that we want to say that we're the best versus ensuring that the client is making an informed decision, because the client that makes an informed decision and still chooses you is staying with you for life. And so the beginning is just about this exploration and getting them to talk and getting them to explore. And then we move on to, like, here's table stakes for us and what are table stakes for you, and then so on and so forth.
Yeah, and so as you're going through that process and you run into something that just tells you it's not going to be a fit, what role do you seem to play, or what role do you feel like you play when that person hasn't found their forever home? They're still looking, but you've figured out that it's just not the right fit for your organization. Where does it go from there?
Yeah, so I think many people can relate to this. We've gone down the process with people who, from the beginning, were not a great fit for, or vice versa. And I think we're only a 2-year-old business, even though our book of business is obviously much older than that. But the entity itself is only 2 years old. So
Sure.
new to a new player in the space, you're like anxious to get people excited about what you're doing and on board. And in retrospect, I mean, stopping the conversations with people where there wasn't a mutual fit would have probably been better. I think a lot of people can relate to that. But for us, it is about ultimately finding them a place to go to next. So very upfront, and anybody who emails me, any wholesalers or sales professionals, I immediately am very upfront with, doesn't make sense to move forward, don't want to waste your time. We try to be very direct with folks where there isn't a mutual fit, in a very kind and compassionate way, with the added piece of, but we want to continue to support you in this discovery phase. Here are 3 firms that we really trust and recommend. here are the reasons why we trust and recommend them versus others, and we're happy to do a personal handoff. By the way, there's no referral program or anything like that. We've identified the firms that we think are really ethical and good, and we will direct advisors to them. What we'll also do is we recorded a webinar, an informational webinar, where we talk to our client base, so the advisors, about the landscape of the industry broadly and how to think about options and how to think about what's the right fit for you. And we share that with everybody. And it's not a journey commercial. It is literally objective. Like, here's the industry. If you're making a decision, here's how to think about that decision. And here are different ways in which you can approach it. And so we do our best to guide people to the next possible solution for them.
And how would somebody access that content?
It's on YouTube. It may be unlisted. It's a long one. I share it. It's called I don't remember, a new perspective on independence or something like that.
Because if they just type in Penny Phillips,
they'll find me on YouTube. Yeah,
they're going to have a little journey to go through all the pardon the pun.
Yeah,
they're going to have a little journey to go through all the content. So, but it's a fairly lengthy video, I would guess.
It is. It's a 45-minute webinar, but I tell every business owner today, in this industry or not, create content that you can share with potential clients, that you can share to not just deepen brand awareness about what you do, but that can also show people real time how you help your client, your end customer, make decisions. And there's a number of ways in which you can use content. You can use it promotionally. You can use it on social media. You can simply share it with the prospect. Like, here's something informational that'll be helpful to you. And if you have no preconceived notions about what that will lead to, in other words, you're not sending that and then obsessively emailing the next day, like, do you want to come on board with us? If you're simply allowing curiosity on your end and the other person's end to sort of unfold, you will find that you will have better ROI than when you're obsessed with posting something and trying to see how many likes and emails you get as a result of it.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed, I've been privileged to talk and really develop some relationships with some of the more successful people in our industry. And it almost seems like the more successful they are, the better their ability to be real with me, and the better their ability to share, what's going on in their world, what they're really proud of, what they're really afraid of. And I think that's a skill that is really transcendent. So I consider you to be very successful. And so I'm going to ask you this on the open forum. What are you most proud of that you've done to this point? And what keeps you up at night?
I very much appreciate that. I do not see myself as very successful yet, but it's a question that, as many entrepreneurs can relate to, it's a question that I think about all the time. And I'm not answering your question yet, but you get to a place, but it's related. You get to a place where you're like, I have all this stuff or all these accolades, and I thought it would feel this way, but it doesn't. It doesn't feel like success. And so is there ever a point? I think that's sort of the conclusion we come to, that success is not about the money. It's not about the accolades. It's about something much deeper within ourselves. That's a whole other conversation. So what am I most proud of? I'm tremendously proud of, obviously, this venture journey, pulling this together, launching it, having it be successful. I mean, we're around and going to be around for a long time is tremendous. But when anyone asks me that, I always think about my family and why I'm doing this. And, buying a home, I'm actually in the home right now, a home for my parents to retire into I could never be prouder of that. Like anything other than helping my family who came here, really with nothing, have the American dream in the end. That's everything to me and drives every decision I make. So I would say I'm most proud of that, being able to do that for them through my work and through the successes I've had. What keeps me up at night? Oh gosh, everything. If you have anxiety, you barely sleep. Okay. So that's the reality. I'll think about something I said in the fourth grade that maybe upset someone. And I'm like, should I reach out to them on Facebook? And anyway, but real time,
So maybe your biggest challenge is actually getting some sleep.
oh,
Huh?
they're 100%. But what keeps me up at night, I would say, is I am really, for me, success is, again, less about the assets under management and revenue, although my CFO would disagree, and more about people's satisfaction and fulfillment in what we're doing. And that's not just the clients, meaning the end investor, that's the advisors who have trusted us with their business, and that is our team members. So the things that keep me up at night is really like, is everyone okay? Is everyone engaged? Is everyone feeling like this is a place that makes them happy? And I think when you're obsessed with that, and again, this is where the female and the empathy thing come into play. When you're obsessed with that, I think it leads you to make good decisions, and it leads you to be very, very in tune with what people need from you in order to feel good and happy. And so other people's feelings, I guess, keep me up at night, as the moral of the story.
Well, I think the good news is in my limited interactions, your reputation is one that you should be really proud of.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And it's obviously a compendium of all the interactions you've had throughout your career, and that's just something you build over time. It never ends. It never starts. It never stops. But I can tell you that wherever you've come to, the outside opinion is really strong.
Thank you. That's
So let's talk about going home. You actually got to go back to your parents' homeland last August, right?
that's right. I go every year. We all make I mean, anyone in the Northeast, I would say. We tend to go back, like the Greek Americans in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut tend to go every year. And so we do. We have a home in Sparta. That's where my mom was actually born. And so, yes, I was there. Feels like forever.
So there's an annual celebration, and it's I guess centered around hope. Is that a fair description of it?
It is it's August 15th, I think, is what you're referring to, and it is a national holiday. It's a religious holiday, and it's celebrating the Virgin Mary, and it's really just a day where everybody party. We go to church, and then we just party with our family in the village. It's an amazing experience, by the way. It's incredible.
And one of the experiences there is getting to be with your extended family all in one spot.
Yeah.
Right. How would you say their opinion of you and your career has changed over time?
Wow.
Because our family can tend to be the hardest on us, or maybe the people that don't understand what we're doing the most. Is that the case for you, or is it a little different?
They have no idea what I do. They have never had any idea what I do, and they never will. I'm very tight.
Well, good. Don't let them watch Ozark then, because that'll give them the total wrong idea.
Very tight knit Greek family, big fat Greek, everything. I mean, my father is a character. He's 70 years old, doesn't own a cell phone, never owned a cell phone. Just he's always at the shop. He owns a mom and pop music store. He's at the shop or at the house, and yeah, no clue what I do. I think my family, I struggled with them. Not literally, but I had a hard time finding my place in the family and just sort of in the greater world in my 20s or even before that, they didn't want me to go away to school. I defied them. I mean, I went to school in New York City, but I spent some time in London at the London School of Economics. They were horrified. I mean, it's hilarious to think about. Full scholarship to LSE, and they were devastated and crying every day. Like, it was dramatic. And then going into business, and they didn't want me to do that. They felt that it was too tough out there. And, so it was sort of always fighting them. And I think eventually they recognized that I was destined to I guess do this or do something in this industry, and so they've let up a little bit. But it's always a battle. I mean, I know they would love for me to be married with kids, and all that will come. But right, I think they just view me as this sort of weird being.
Well, I mean, I think that's especially a challenge for females, but it's, all of our families set up these guardrails based on their past experiences, and the thing that's always tough about it is it's always done with, or most of the time, it's done with the best of intentions.
So true.
And so it's really hard to break through those guardrails and at the same time, go back and honor your roots. So it's nice that you're able to do that. I know that's a tough line to walk, and it's probably, there's not a day that goes by that there's not a little bit of conflict there, but
every day.
I guess that's what makes this interesting. If it was easy, everybody'd do it.
It's right. And listen, I've had a lot of therapy and I've had a lot of coaching, and I believe very much in self-work and development and understanding yourself and understanding others. And when you get to a place where you really understand people and even your family and why they say certain things or do certain things, it does make you a better, more empathetic leader in all aspects of life. So I do recommend, especially for women, get the support system that you need to sift through all of this pressure that family and society puts on you.
And so, just for our audience, before we wrap it up, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that the amount of content and the expert advice that Penny's given over the years is, gosh, you could probably devote a week and not go through it all. If you really have the motivation to make yourself better, if you really want to learn more about practice management, if you just really want somebody who's been on the ground floor, worked with people that are very successful, built their own successful firms, who is willing to share that knowledge with the rest of the universe. I'm lucky to be talking to her right now, and just type in Penny Phillips anywhere on the internet, sit down, pour a big cup of coffee, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. So, Penny, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Anytime. I really appreciate you.
And that's a wrap for this episode of A Voice from the Hills podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. And just a reminder that for access to this episode and all prior episodes, you can follow A Voice from the Hills podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcast content. We'd love it if you would subscribe to the pod, post a review, and give us a rating. If you'd like updates on future podcasts and all our other content, you can also follow A Voice from the Hills and Silicon Hills Wealth Management on social media. If you'd like to learn more about Silicon Hills Wealth and the services we offer, please check us out at our website at siliconhillswealth.com. And please know that your engagement and feedback is truly a gift. We can only do our best work when you are here to listen. Thank you.